The scream pierced through the quiet of Birchwood Lane like a jagged knife. Agnes Henderson jolted upright in her armchair, her knitting needles clattering to the floor. Her heart thudded, her sharp eyes darting toward the pale blue house at the end of the street. "Emily," she muttered, gripping the edge of her window sill. Agnes wasn't one for idle gossip, but she had spent enough years observing people to know when something wasn't right. The Sinclairs had moved into the neighborhood a year ago, and from the outside they seemed like the perfect couple. Darren Sinclair was charming, handsome, and successful, while Emily was soft-spoken and always impeccably dressed. But perfection was a lie. Agnes had seen the signs, the bruises Emily tried to hide, the way she flinched when Darren raised his voice, the stifled cries that sometimes echoed through the night. The scream tonight was different. It was raw, desperate, and it made Agnes's blood run cold. Moments later, the front door of the Sinclair house slammed open and Darren stormed out. His face was a mask of fury, his tie hanging loosely around his neck as he marched to his car. With a deafening roar, the vehicle sped down the street, leaving silence in its wake. Agnes stood frozen for a moment, her instincts warring with her caution. Finally, she grabbed her coat and made her way across the street. Emily opened the door reluctantly, her face pale and streaked with tears. She clutched the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Mrs. Henderson," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's late, what are you doing here?" "I heard the commotion," Agnes said, pushing past her without waiting for an invitation. "And don't bother lying. I've heard enough to know something's wrong." The living room was in shambles. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, and the coffee table had been shoved askew. Agnes's gaze fell on a dark stain on the carpet, a splash of red near a jagged shard of glass. Emily moved to block her view, but Agnes had already seen enough. "Emily," she said gently, "you need help." The scream pierced through the quiet of Birchwood Lane like a jagged knife. Agnes Henderson jolted upright in her armchair, her knitting needles clattering to the floor. Her heart thudded, her sharp eyes darting toward the pale blue house at the end of the street. "Emily," she muttered, gripping the edge of her window sill. Agnes wasn't one for idle gossip, but she had spent enough years observing people to know when something wasn't right. The Sinclairs had moved into the neighborhood a year ago, and from the outside they seemed like the perfect couple. Darren Sinclair was charming, handsome, and successful, while Emily was soft-spoken and always impeccably dressed. But perfection was a lie. Agnes had seen the signs, the bruises Emily tried to hide, the way she flinched when Darren raised his voice, the stifled cries that sometimes echoed through the night. The scream tonight was different. It was raw, desperate, and it made Agnes's blood run cold. Moments later, the front door of the Sinclair house slammed open and Darren stormed out. His face was a mask of fury, his tie hanging loosely around his neck as he marched to his car. With a deafening roar, the vehicle sped down the street, leaving silence in its wake. Agnes stood frozen for a moment, her instincts warring with her caution. Finally, she grabbed her coat and made her way across the street. Emily opened the door reluctantly, her face pale and streaked with tears. She clutched the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Mrs. Henderson," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's late, what are you doing here?" "I heard the commotion," Agnes said, pushing past her without waiting for an invitation. "And don't bother lying. I've heard enough to know something's wrong." The living room was in shambles. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, and the coffee table had been shoved askew. Agnes's gaze fell on a dark stain on the carpet, a splash of red near a jagged shard of glass. Emily moved to block her view, but Agnes had already seen enough. "Emily," she said gently, "you need help." Emily shook her head, her arms wrapping around herself like armor. "I'm fine. Really. Darren and I just had an argument. It's nothing to worry about." Agnes's lips thinned. "That wasn't an argument," she said. "That was violence. And it's not the first time, is it?" Emily looked away, her silence confirming everything Agnes suspected. "You don't have to live like this," Agnes said softly. "There are ways out." "I can't," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "Darren's powerful. He knows people, judges, lawyers, even the police. If I try to leave, he'll destroy me." Agnes's eyes hardened. "Then we'll outsmart him," she said. "But you'll need to trust me." Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the door as if Darren might burst in at any moment. "Come to my house tomorrow," Agnes said. "We'll talk more then." The next day, Emily arrived at Agnes's house looking like a ghost of herself. Her skin was pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. Agnes ushered her inside and poured her a cup of tea. "I've been thinking," Agnes began. If Darren's as untouchable as you say, we'll need evidence. Solid evidence. Enough to expose him to the world. Emily frowned. What kind of evidence? Recordings, photos, anything that shows what he's done to you, Agnes said. But we'll need to be careful. If he finds out what we're doing, he'll kill me, Emily finished quietly. Agnes's hand tightened around her teacup. Then we'll make sure he doesn't. Over the next hour, Agnes laid out a plan. She handed Emily a small notebook. Write down everything he does, she instructed. Dates, times, details. And don't leave anything out. Emily stared at the notebook like it was a ticking time bomb. Where will I hide it? Here, Agnes said. Bring it to me whenever you've added something. I'll keep it safe. Emily nodded hesitantly. And the other evidence? Agnes reached into a drawer and pulled out a tiny recording device. Start with this. Hide it where he won't notice. Emily took the device with trembling hands. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. Agnes placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than you think, she said. And you're not alone in this. The first recording Emily captured was devastating. Darren's voice was like a whip, cutting through the air as he berated her over a trivial mistake. You're useless, he snarled. I don't know why I bother keeping you around. Emily played the recording for Agnes the next night, her hands trembling. This is good, Agnes said, her voice calm despite the fury burning in her eyes. It's a start. But Darren's behavior grew more erratic. He began coming home earlier than usual, scrutinizing Emily's every move. You've been acting strange, he said one evening, his eyes narrowing. What are you hiding? Nothing, Emily said, forcing a smile. Darren didn't look convinced. Emily rushed to Agnes's house that night, her heart pounding. He's getting suspicious, she said. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Agnes frowned, her mind racing. Then we'll have to move faster, she said. As they reviewed the recordings, Agnes stumbled upon something unexpected. Darren, speaking on the phone, laughing as he discussed falsifying financial records. What is this? Emily asked, her brow furrowing. Evidence, Agnes said grimly. Not just of abuse but of criminal activity. This could be our way out. Emily's eyes widened. Do you think it's enough? Not yet, Agnes said. But it's a start. 2 days later, Emily's world came crashing down. She was in the kitchen washing dishes, when Darren's thunderous voice bellowed through the house. Emily, get in here. The plate slipped from her soapy hands, shattering in the sink. Her stomach churned as she wiped her hands on a towel and made her way to the living room. Darren stood in the center of the room, his face twisted with fury. In his hand was the hidden camera. What the hell is this? He demanded, shoving it in her face. Emily's mouth went dry. I don't know. Don't lie to me. Darren roared. I found this in my office. Who are you working with? And no one, she stammered. I swear Darren grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. You've been spying on me, haven't you? Recording me in my own house? Emily tried to pull away, her heart racing. It's not what you think. Then what is it? Darren snarled, his face inches from hers. What's your game, Emily? Who put you up to this? Her mind scrambled for an answer, but the fear paralyzed her. Darren's eyes bored into hers, and for a moment she thought he might strike her. Instead he released her with a shove. I should have known you were too stupid to do this on your own, he said coldly. Whoever you're working with, they'll regret crossing me. He stormed out of the room, leaving Emily trembling. She knew she had to act fast. Emily ran to Agnes's house, tears streaming down her face. Agnes opened the door and took one look at her before ushering her inside. What happened? Agnes demanded. He found the camera, Emily said, her voice shaking. He knows I've been spying on him. He's furious. I think he's going to hurt me. Agnes's face darkened. Did he find anything else? I don't think so, Emily said. But he's suspicious. He knows I'm up to something. Agnes placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's time to finish this, she said. We have enough evidence to expose him. You just need to be brave a little longer. Emily nodded, though fear still gripped her heart. The following day, Darren filed for divorce. His lawyer's paperwork accused Emily of infidelity, mental instability, and even theft. Darren was clearly trying to ruin her reputation before she could ruin his. But Emily and Agnes had a plan. With the help of a trusted attorney, they compiled all the evidence they had gathered, the recordings of Darren's abuse, photos of Emily's injuries, and the incriminating audio of Darren discussing his embezzlement scheme. Agnes also reached out to an investigative journalist she had known in her younger days, ensuring that the story would gain public attention if Darren tried to use his influence to suppress it. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Emily faced Darren for the first time since the camera incident. Darren sat with his lawyer, his confidence oozing as he leaned back in his chair. Emily's attorney began by presenting the recordings of Darren's verbal abuse. The courtroom fell silent as his angry, venomous words echoed through the speakers. "Do you deny this is your voice, Mr. Sinclair?" the attorney asked. Darren's lawyer stood. "Objection. These recordings could have been fabricated." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled. Continue." Next came the photos, images of Emily's bruises and cuts, accompanied by medical reports that confirmed the injuries were consistent with physical assault. Darren shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering. Finally, the piece de resistance, the recording of Darren discussing his financial crimes. "You're telling me we can just fudge the numbers?" Darren's voice crackled through the speakers. "Of course," another voice replied. "As long as no one checks the books, we're golden." Darren's face turned ashen. Emily's attorney turned to the judge. "Not only is my client a victim of domestic violence, but Mr. Sinclair is also implicated in serious financial crimes. This evidence speaks for itself." The judge's gavel struck the desk. "I've seen enough. Mr. Sinclair, you will be arrested and detained for further investigation into these allegations. As for the divorce proceedings, all of your claims against Mrs. Sinclair are hereby dismissed. She is granted full control of her share of the assets and a restraining order against you." Darren's face twisted with unbridled rage as the officers led him away in handcuffs. The courtroom murmured with shock, the once pristine image of the charming Darren Sinclair shattered in an instant. "Do you think this is over, Emily?" he spat, his voice venomous. "You think you've won? I'll ruin you." Emily sat frozen for a moment, but then something inside her shifted. She straightened her back, her chin lifting in quiet defiance. "No, Darren. You're done ruining me." The officers tightened their grip as Darren struggled against them. His threats echoed through the courtroom, but Emily refused to look away. She held his gaze until the doors slammed shut behind him. The day after the courtroom showdown, Darren's arrest became headline news. His embezzlement scheme, coupled with the abuse allegations, turned the once respected businessman into a public pariah. Agnes's journalist friend published an exposé that included not only the details of Darren's crimes but also Emily's harrowing account of the abuse she endured. The article painted a stark picture of a woman trapped by fear and manipulation, and how she found her way to freedom with the help of an unlikely ally. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded Emily's inbox, while Darren's former associates distanced themselves, issuing carefully worded statements about how they'd had no knowledge of his actions. Agnes, sitting in her armchair, read the comments aloud with a smirk. "Listen to this one," she said, holding her tablet. "Darren Sinclair deserves to rot in jail for what he did. Women like Emily are heroes for standing up to monsters like him." Emily, sipping tea across from her, managed a small smile. "It feels surreal," she admitted. "I spent so long being invisible and now, people are actually listening." Agnes nodded. "People are listening because you were brave enough to speak." Despite his arrest, Darren wasn't entirely powerless. Emily's lawyer warned her to be cautious. "Darren's resources are dwindling, but he still has connections," he said. "There's always the possibility he'll try to manipulate things from behind bars." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let him try. I'm not afraid anymore." But that night, as she returned to her home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed longer, the creak of the house louder. The next morning, Emily found a letter slid under her door. The handwriting was unmistakable. "You'll never truly be free of me." Her breath hitched as she clutched the note. Without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and ran to Agnes's house. Agnes read the letter with pursed lips. "He's desperate," she said. "Desperate men do stupid things. But this is nothing more than a tantrum." "I don't feel safe," Emily admitted. "And you shouldn't," Agnes said firmly. "Not yet. But there are ways to protect yourself." Agnes contacted her journalist friend again, who agreed to include the letter in a follow-up article. "The world needs to see that Darren's manipulation didn't end with his arrest," she said. They also reported the threat to the police, ensuring that Darren's actions would be closely monitored. Inside his prison cell, Darren's world crumbled. His influence waned as his crimes became public knowledge. Former allies turned their backs and his legal team struggled to keep up with the mounting charges. Emily's lawyer contacted her weeks later with an update. "They're adding harassment and intimidation charges to his case," he said. "That letter you handed over? It sealed the deal. He won't be getting out anytime soon." Emily exhaled deeply, a weight lifting off her chest. Months passed and life began to settle. Emily sold the house she once shared with Darren and moved into a cozy apartment not far from Agnes. She enrolled in a local college, determined to finish her degree and rebuild her life. Agnes, ever the nosy but lovable neighbor, visited often. She had become more than an ally, she was family. One evening, as they sat on Emily's balcony watching the sunset, Agnes turned to her with a smile. "You know, dear, I've seen a lot in my years. But you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening. "I wouldn't have made it without you, Agnes. You saved me." Agnes chuckled. "Oh, nonsense. You saved yourself. I just gave you a little nudge." The two women sat in companionable silence, the past slowly giving way to the promise of a brighter future. Darren's prison experience. Darren's first weeks in prison were a nightmare. Stripped of his power and influence, he was just another inmate. The smirk he once wore so confidently was gone, replaced by a hardened, bitter scowl. The other prisoners, many of whom had been wronged by men like Darren, were not welcoming. His reputation as an abuser and fraudster had spread through the facility, thanks to the media coverage. Inmates jeered at him during mealtimes, and guards watched him closely, ensuring he didn't find any allies to manipulate. One day, during a routine cell inspection, a guard found a hastily scrawled letter under Darren's mattress. "When I get out of here, I'll make her pay." The discovery added another layer of charges to Darren's case. The judge overseeing his trial made it clear. Darren Sinclair would serve a long sentence with no chance of parole for at least 15 years. With Darren out of her life, Emily threw herself into her studies. She chose to major in social work, inspired by her own experiences and a newfound desire to help others who felt trapped as she once had. Initially, the transition wasn't easy. Sitting in classrooms filled with younger students, many of whom had never faced true adversity, made her feel out of place. But Emily was determined. She devoured textbooks, participated in class discussions, and sought mentorship from professors who recognized her passion and resilience. Her hard work paid off. Within 2 years, Emily landed an internship at a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic abuse. It was a role that felt both challenging and deeply meaningful. She often stayed late at the office, counseling women who reminded her of herself, scared, unsure, and searching for a way out. One day, while speaking to a client, Emily realized just how far she'd come. "You're so strong," the woman said tearfully, clutching Emily's hand. "I don't know how you do it." Emily smiled softly, squeezing the woman's hand. "I wasn't always this way," she said. "But with time and support, you'll find your strength too." Emily also began volunteering at local community centers, sharing her story in workshops and seminars. At first, standing in front of a crowd made her nervous, but as she saw the impact of her words on others, her confidence grew. "I'm not here to tell you it's easy," she told one group of women. "But leaving is possible. Healing is possible. You are stronger than you think." Her workshops gained traction, and soon, Emily was invited to speak at larger events. Media outlets picked up her story, framing her as a beacon of hope for domestic abuse survivors. For a long time, Emily avoided relationships. The scars Darren had left, both physical and emotional, made it hard for her to trust. But over time, as she healed, she realized she didn't want to let the past define her future. At one of her speaking events, she met David, a kind-hearted journalist who had covered her story in the early days. He approached her after her talk, commending her courage and asking thoughtful questions about her journey. Their connection was immediate but slow-burning. David was patient, understanding that Emily needed time to open her heart. He never rushed her, and his genuine kindness reminded her that not all men were like Darren. Over the next year, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. On their 1-year anniversary, David surprised her with a small gesture that brought tears to her eyes, a framed photo of a phoenix rising from the ashes. "This is how I see you," he said. "Strong, resilient, unstoppable." For the first time in years, Emily felt like she could believe in love again. Meanwhile, Agnes remained a steadfast presence in Emily's life. Though her health began to decline, her sharp wit and determination never wavered. One afternoon, Emily visited Agnes and found her poring over blueprints and grant proposals. "What's all this?" Emily asked, setting down a basket of groceries. Agnes grinned. "A project," she said. I'm using my savings to start a shelter for women like you. Women who need a safe place to land while they figure out their next steps. Emily's eyes widened. Agnes, that's incredible. It's nothing compared to what you've done, Agnes said. But I've lived a long life, dear. It's time to put what I've got left to good use. The shelter, named Haven House, opened 6 months later with Emily as its director. Agnes attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony in a wheelchair, her face beaming with pride. Despite Emily's progress, Darren's influence occasionally loomed. Even from prison he managed to stir up trouble, filing frivolous lawsuits against her and leaking false stories to the media. But Emily was ready. Each time Darren attempted to disrupt her life, she faced him head-on, armed with a team of lawyers and the unshakable support of her community. Over time, Darren's power faded entirely. His lawsuits were dismissed, his name became synonymous with disgrace, and his connections abandoned him. Emily heard through the grapevine that he'd been transferred to a maximum security prison after inciting a fight with another inmate. It was a fitting end for a man who had thrived on control, now utterly powerless. Emily's story became a catalyst for change in the community. Donations poured into Haven House, allowing them to expand their services. Emily partnered with local law enforcement to create better training programs for handling domestic violence cases. She also began working with lawmakers, advocating for stricter penalties for abusers and better protections for survivors. Her testimony before the state legislature helped pass a bill that funded more shelters and provided legal aid for victims. I never thought I'd be standing here, Emily said during her testimony. But if sharing my story can help even one person, then it's worth it. Years later, Emily stood on the stage at a national conference, addressing a packed auditorium. I used to think I was powerless, she said. I believed the lies that were fed to me. But the truth is I was never powerless. I just needed someone to remind me of my strength. She glanced down at the front row, where David sat beside Agnes, who was now in her 90s. Both smiled up at her with pride. I hope my story shows you that no matter how dark things seem, there is always a way forward, Emily continued. And there is always someone willing to walk that path with you. The crowd erupted in applause as Emily stepped back from the podium, her heart full. She was no longer the woman who had cowered in the shadows. She was a survivor, a fighter, and a beacon of hope for others. And for the first time in her life she truly felt free. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by liking this video, share and subscribe to our channel. Also turn on the post notification bell so that you will be notified each time we post a story.